So, opening song, Chim Chim Cheree, Step in Time, Feed the Birds, A Spoonful of Sugar. Songs from the 1964 movie musical, Mary Poppins. They are seared in my memory. It was one of my favorite movies as a child, and many of its songs formed the lullabies that I sang to my girls, and now my grandchildren, and raucous song fests in the car as we traveled place to place, first in my family of origin, and then with my own daughters. My youngest daughter, Katie, wore out our VHS version of Mary Poppins. I read all of P.L. Travers' books growing up. You see, Mary Poppins was an integral part of my growing up. I mean, I can even still spell supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. So it was with both excitement and a little bit of trepidation that we set out the day after Christmas, 3 generations together, to see the new movie, Mary Poppins Returns. Would it have the same magic? Could a book written in the 1930s translate into something that my grandchildren would love as much as I did? How would 2018 deal with a character I fell in love with in 1964? Well, as we look at the church, at the changes that we see from the churches of our childhood, at the seeming disinterest in the church from those we know and love, we face many of those same questions. Will the church of our future touch our lives and the lives of those we love in the same way that the church of our past did for all of us? And those musings, they are nothing new. The early church actually had the same questions. So this vision that's presented in the book of Revelation was a hope-filled word for a people who were in a changing and often ruthless environment. And the end of the Revelation contains the wonderful words that we heard read to us this morning, a picture of God's presence among God's people in a new way, in a new world. Revelation's vision of the future, you see, encompasses both human beings and the world itself. The God who created the world holds out a future for the world and for the people who belong in it. So Matt mentioned in the children's time the 12 Days of Christmas song, which was really a theological treatise in a song. So today is the 6th day of Christmas. Anyone know what the 6 geese a-laying actually stand for? It stands for the 6 days of creation, which is really appropriate because throughout Revelation, God is identified as the creator. There's this big throne room vision of God in chapter 4, and God is given praise for having brought all things into being. And then in the 5th chapter, every creature in heaven and on earth gives praise to God and the Lamb for the life that they bring. And to speak of the future in terms of a new creation, as we read today, it never denies the value of the first creation. Rather, it affirms that creation is what God does. And the counterpart to creation is not dissolution, but new creation. Yes, we know that death is very real for those whom God has created. Yet in Christ, there's this promise of resurrection. And resurrection is a new act of creation. Resurrection is this promise of a new existence, a transformed existence. And that's what John envisions for the whole world itself. Yes, death affects all of us and the world to which we belong. Many of us have experienced that this year. Yet in his restless will to redeem, God always holds out this promise of making us and our world new. And this new creation is marked in part by an absence of powers that oppose God and diminish life. So in these dramatic visions that we find in Revelation, it tells of the final defeat of evil and the liberation of earth and humanity from all those forces that have held it captive. And the resurrection of all the dead brings an end to death itself. Therefore, in this new creation, there is an absence of death, of mourning, of crying, of pain, for all those marks of a former fallen world have passed away. At the same time, the new creation is characterized by the presence of the God who brings life. And so there's this voice from the throne that declares that God's dwelling will be here on earth with humankind. God will dwell with them and be with them. Now, lest you think that that kind of talk only happens in Revelation, these opening lines from chapter 21 are simply a cascade of biblical promises brought to their realization. In sort of breathtaking succession, one after the other, the words of the prophets of the Old Testament are taken up and re-proclaimed. For instance, to say, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and to speak of the new Jerusalem descending like a bride adorned for her husband, takes up the themes of what we call Third Isaiah. Announcing that God's dwelling place is among people recalls the prophet Ezekiel. And proclaiming that death will be no more and that God will wipe away every tear from their eyes is a resounding affirmation of Isaiah 25. To say that the first or former things have passed away returns, while declaring that God makes all things new, that echoes once again the promises of the prophet Isaiah. So this use of language from the prophets in this climactic vision of Revelation is more than just curiosity. It underscores the very integrity of God. What God has spoken, God will do. There's this integrity that's ongoing between God's speech and God's action. And Revelation's vision for the future does not rely on some sort of optimistic reading of the present, because we hear loud and clear as we read those chapters that sin and evil and death all call the future into question. Yet all of the prophets and the author of Revelation bring a word of hope into the present by affirming that the God who has created all things is the same God that brings all things to completion. And so we read those wonderful words. God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And the world's existence and our own existence are always framed by the presence of God. In God, the future holds the promise of life. And so today we celebrate birth, the birth of God's Son, as we continue on the 6th day of Christmas, all the way until the 12th day, which is the day before we celebrate the Epiphany. Many of you might have seen the movie Under the Tuscan Sun, and in that movie we hear this line, and Max, this one's for you. In Italian, to give birth, dare alla luce, means to give to the light. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, those Italians are incredibly poetic. To describe a baby bursting into the world as giving way to the light. So we envision the baby coming out of the dark warmth of the womb into the light of the world. And what is a baby's response? They cry. Wah. Jesus tells his disciples that they must be born again, that they must be made new. And Paul says to the Corinthians in the 5th chapter of his second letter to them that everything has become new. So what is all this new life? What does it mean to be born anew? Now, a lot of us steer away from that phrase, born again, because it has so much baggage, but we can find some powerful insight as we consider what happens as we hit the light of a new day. What will we do when we encounter the light of new life in Christ? What will our cry be like? Because, friends, new life always involves tears. Now, we know that some babies need to be encouraged to cry. They need to fill their lungs with air to survive, and so sometimes they need a little bit of encouragement. And sometimes life gives us a wake-up call, and we realize that we are barely breathing. So new life invites us to take a gulp of breath. Spirare, the root of the words that mean both spirit and breath. It's essential to breathe if we're to live to full capacity. Then some babies need to have their eyes cleared so that they can open them and see. They're just filled with all sorts of gunk. What might we be hiding from? Needing to sort of take the wool out from over our own eyes and face the things that we need to change in order to grow into what God has created us to be. How are we maybe insulating from the light through denial or dread or fear? God's presence and strength are with us. And it's time for us to step into that glorious or filled with light existence with confidence. And perhaps if we come through, if we take that big breath, open our eyes to see, have a good cry to find our voice in this world, the silence that follows is not just a calm and a settled silence. It's more of an anticipatory silence, like breath held in expectation. What will the next sound be? How will we fill that silence? What will we say? How will we now be the ones made in the image of the light of life and following the footsteps of the one whose star shone on humankind? How will we bring peace on earth and goodwill to all creation so that a new heaven comes to this new earth? And that's our question, isn't it, church? How will we share the love and grace of God in a new way that will reach a new generation? We might personally not like the music, the dancing, the lingo, the way of doing things that seem to be reaching non-churched people today. But we might surprise ourselves if we throw ourselves into the task of what this church needs to do and be wholeheartedly. I read that Dick Van Dyke, who starred alongside Julie Andrews in the original Mary Poppins, made a cameo appearance in Mary Poppins Returns. And at age 93, and there are very few of you in this room who exceed that age, so there might be one or two, but at age 93, he was offered 4 options for his dance scene in this cameo, each one with a varying degree of difficulty. And he insisted on performing the hardest dance routine and refused any help from other cast members while filming his scene. He wanted to be part of something new and memorable, to bring the magic of the story to a new generation. And then conversely, against the opinion of many future-thinking cinematographers, director Rob Marshall decided to use the traditional style of hand-drawn animation rather than computer-generated animation because he wanted the audience to regain the nostalgia of the first film. So more than 70 animators, some of whom were even retired, were recruited to design and create the animated sequences, which took them 16 months. So they too reached out to a new generation with the magic of story, using a more traditional technique. New and old. A new heaven and a new earth, pulling everything together to welcome God into our presence. Band instruments and choir. The incredible birth story continues way past Christmas, taking on new meaning and told in new ways each time it is told to the next generation. So what will you do with this gift of story? Will you rigidly cling to the old ways without ever giving the new a chance? Will you throw out the old and only concentrate on the new? Or perhaps, will this church be one of those that creatively treasures the past while opening our hearts and minds to the new? Will you look for God to be with us in every iteration of the story? By the way, we loved the movie. It retains the flavor of the first movie, yet utilizes technology and creativity and the musicality of now. The story is just as magical. The character of Mary Poppins is just as captivating as it was in the first movie, that one that I grew up with. My grandchildren have both soundtracks. They know the songs from both movies, and they love to sing all of them. It's possible to merge the old into the new, the traditional into the contemporary, the past into the present and future, and to create a story that can be heard by all. So our question is, are we willing to go on the journey for the future of the church, for the salvation of our children and our children's children? I pray with all of my heart that the answer to that is a resounding yes. For it is then that the revelation makes sense. And the words, "Then God said to me, all is done. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will freely give water from the life-giving spring." Because people are thirsty for God. And we have the water to give to them. The church may never look exactly like the church of our childhood, but we'll recognize it because God will surely be in it. May it be so. Amen.